Welcome back to Farang Footprints, where real lives unfold far away from home, in places chosen not for adventure, but for silence. Today's story is told by John, a man who spent most of his adult life building something solid, a business, a routine, a future shared with one woman, until an accident ended everything. There were no children, no unfinished arguments, no dramatic collapse. Only space. With enough money saved and nothing left to prove, John believed his final chapter would be quiet, measured, predictable. Chiang Mai seemed like the right place for that, a city where time moves slower and solitude feels intentional, but life rarely respects plans made in grief. On a small island called Koh Chang, during a holiday meant to be forgettable, John met a woman who carried more truth than she revealed. She was independent, grounded, and carefully incomplete. This is not a story about deception born from greed. It is a story about fear, timing, and the cost of honesty, about a secret kept too long, and the choice to face it fully. This is John's story, told in his own words.
When my wife died, nothing collapsed. That was the strangest part. There was no dramatic unraveling, no visible breakdown. The business kept running. The accounts balanced. The routine stayed intact. If anything, life became quieter. Not empty, just reduced. We had built everything together. The company, the structure, the habits. Work had been our language. Love expressed through efficiency, through shared goals, through long days that ended with mutual exhaustion and silent understanding. The accident ended that language abruptly. One phone call, one hospital corridor, one sentence spoken too carefully. After the funeral, people expected something from me: grief, anger, withdrawal. I offered politeness instead. I thanked them for their concern, returned to work, and let the machinery of my life keep moving. It was easier that way. We had no children. Not by tragedy, by choice. At least, that is what we told ourselves. In truth, there had always been another deadline, another expansion, another year where things would settle down. Eventually, we were both in our 50s, and the conversation quietly expired. I did not regret it at first. Children complicate lives. That had been our belief. Standing alone in a house built for two, I felt the absence differently, not as longing, but as silence, and had nowhere to echo. Retirement came without ceremony. The business was sold cleanly. Enough money to never worry again. Friends congratulated me on my freedom. I smiled and nodded. Freedom is a strange word when you have nowhere you need to be. Days stretched. Evenings arrived early. I did not drink excessively. I did not spiral. I simply existed in a well-organized pause. Thailand entered my thoughts, not as an escape, but as an idea. I had been once before, years ago, on a business trip that barely scratched the surface. I remembered warmth, courtesy, a pace that did not demand urgency. Chiang Mai appealed to me immediately. Not Bangkok, too loud. Not the islands, too temporary. Chiang Mai felt settled, a place where a man could disappear politely. I booked a flight without ceremony, one suitcase. No grand plan, just time. Koh Chang was not part of the vision. It was a suggestion from a travel agent. Nice place to relax before going north, she said. I agreed without thinking. That is how most important things begin. Not with intention, but with indifference. On Koh Chang, I woke up early, walked to the beach, ate alone, watched couples negotiate their happiness loudly. I did not envy them. I did not miss what I had lost. I simply observed. That is when I met Petty. Not at a bar, not at night, not through circumstance that demanded suspicion. It was midday, hot, ordinary. She asked if the chair next to me was free. I said yes, and for the first time in a long while, something interrupted my quiet. Petty did not sit down like someone asking for permission. She sat like someone used to occupying her own space. That detail stayed with me. She ordered iced coffee without looking at the menu. Spoke English carefully, but confidently. No rehearsed lines. No flirtation disguised as curiosity. We talked about the heat first, about how the island felt slower than expected, about travel that did not need to be productive. She told me she lived in Chiang Mai, owned a small shop, nothing fancy, enough to live, enough to stop. I liked that answer. People who say enough usually mean it. She asked about me. Not my money, not my plans, just where I was from and how long I had been traveling alone. Recently, I said. She nodded, as if that explained more than words could. We met again the next day, and the one after that. No promises, no urgency. We rented a motorbike and rode without destination, ate street food, watched the rain arrive suddenly and leave just as fast. She laughed easily, but not carelessly. When I asked about her past, she did not hide it. I worked in bars before, she said one evening, as if mentioning an old job title. A long time ago. No apology, no justification, just a fact. She told me about saving money, about deciding she did not want to be dependent on anyone, about opening her own small business in Chiang Mai. I believed her, not because the story was convincing, but because it was not dramatic. There was no victimhood in her voice, no bitterness, only distance. We never spoke about family, not because I avoided it, but because the conversation simply did not go there, and I did not push. I had learned long ago that people reveal what they are ready to reveal. Everything else is noise. On my last evening on Koh Chang, we sat on the beach. The sea was dark, the air heavy. I knew I would leave. I also knew this was not over. We exchanged numbers without ceremony. No promises, no plans, just acknowledgement. On the ferry the next morning, I did not feel loss. I felt curiosity. And for a man who had lived years without questions, that felt like something worth following. Chiang Mai felt nothing like Koh Chang. There was no sea to soften the edges, no holiday rhythm, no illusion of timelessness. It was a city that lived. When I arrived, Petty met me near the old city walls. She was not dressed to impress. Simple clothes, practical shoes, comfortable in her surroundings. That told me more than any story could. Her shop was small, clean, unpretentious. It sold everyday items, things people actually needed, not souvenirs, not dreams, just practicality. She ran it with calm efficiency, knew her customers by name, took notes in a worn notebook, counted cash carefully, not obsessively. This was not a side project. It was a life. I watched her work without interfering. She did not perform independence. She embodied it. That mattered to me. We spent our time without urgency. Lunches between customers. Evening walks through neighborhoods tourists never reached. She showed me temples she visited when she needed quiet, cafes she avoided when they got too popular. We talked about routines. I told her about my business, about retirement, about my wife, briefly. She listened without asking for details. Some lives are finished properly, she said once. Some just stop. I did not ask which she thought mine was. I started to imagine Chiang Mai differently, not as a retreat, but as a place where life continued without demanding explanations. Petty never asked for anything. Not help, not money, not promises. That absence created trust faster than effort ever could. When I returned to Wales, the distance felt manageable. We spoke often, not constantly. Enough to feel connected, not enough to feel trapped. I sent photos of my walks. She sent pictures of her shop, her cooking experiments, the occasional rainy afternoon. Everything felt consistent. That is what convinced me. Not passion, not drama, consistency. I began to consider what it would mean to stop visiting and start staying. And for the first time since my wife's death, the thought did not feel like replacement. It felt like continuation. Distance has a way of smoothing edges. Back in Wales, life resumed its efficient stillness. The house remained unchanged. The routines functioned. Nothing demanded adjustment. And yet, something had shifted. Petty existed in my days, not as distraction, but as reference. When I made coffee, I remembered how she preferred hers. When I walked through town, I compared the pace unconsciously. We spoke regularly. Not out of obligation, but because silence felt unnecessary. She never filled conversations with emotion. She shared fragments. A busy day, a customer who complained too much, a new supplier who offered better prices. Ordinary details. Those are the ones that create attachment. I began to imagine a version of myself in Chiang Mai that was not temporary, not a tourist, not a visitor, a resident. The idea felt calm. I researched neighborhoods quietly, read about visas, looked at rental prices, then ownership. Betty mentioned her apartment casually. Rented, small, comfortable. I did not hear complaint in her voice. I heard acceptance. That is what made the idea form naturally. If I stayed longer, if we lived closer, if there was less movement. I did not speak these thoughts immediately. Plans need space before they survive language. During my second trip, the atmosphere was different, familiar, not festive. We settled into patterns quickly. Morning coffee at her place, shared errands, evenings without agenda. I noticed small absences. Appointments she did not explain. Afternoons when she seemed preoccupied. Nothing alarming, just incomplete. I told myself it was none of my business. Trust, after all, is not built by interrogation. Still, the idea of permanence lingered, not as romance, but as logic. I was 55. I had stability. I had time. I had no dependence. She had roots. She had discipline. She had a life. It made sense. An evening, over dinner, I mentioned the possibility of buying a house. Not immediately, not impulsively, just as a concept. Betty did not respond right away. She smiled politely, changed the subject. That was the first moment something felt off, not wrong, just unresolved. I let it go. Some conversations arrive only when they are ready. I did not know then how much silence was still between us. The second visit felt less like a holiday and more like a rehearsal. I stayed longer. Her artisanal place near the old city, close enough to walk to Petty's shop, far enough to keep my own rhythm. That balance mattered. We slipped into routines without discussing them. Mornings together when she opened the shop later, afternoons apart, evenings shared when neither of us felt exhausted. It was easy. Too easy, perhaps. I began to see Chiang Mai not as a backdrop, but as a framework. A place where days did not need to be justified, where time was not something to conquer. Petty's life impressed me more the longer I observed it. She worked consistently, not obsessively, closed the shop when it made sense, took days off without guilt, paid attention to details I would have overlooked. She was not surviving anymore. She was maintaining. That distinction changed how I thought about the future. One afternoon, walking through a quiet neighborhood with old trees and low houses, the idea surfaced again. What about something like this? I asked casually. Long term. She slowed her pace. It is nice, she said. Quiet. Not yes. Not number. Just acknowledgement. Later, over dinner, I spoke more clearly. I am not planning to go back and forth forever, I said. I could imagine staying here. Properly. She listened, smiled, nodded. But something tightened behind her eyes. I did not push. Pressure reveals nothing but resistance. Over the following days, small inconsistencies appeared. She left early some mornings without explanation, took calls outside, returned quieter than usual. Nothing dramatic, nothing accusatory, but different. I asked once if everything was okay. Yes, she said quickly, just busy. I believed her, and yet I did not. Not because she was lying, but because she was carrying something she had not named yet. The house idea returned naturally. We looked at listings together, not seriously, just curiosity. She asked practical questions about ownership, taxes, maintenance. She was thinking, not avoiding. That gave me hope. But hope has a weight. The closer the future moved, the smaller the space for omissions became. One evening, sitting on her balcony, I said something I had not planned to say. If we do this, I said, I want it to be honest. No surprises later. She went very still. The city noise filled the silence between us. I know, she said quietly. That was all. I did not realize then that honesty was already waiting. Not for courage, but for timing. There is a strange tension that appears when two people are close, not emotionally distant, but too aligned. That was where we were. Nothing was wrong between us, and yet something hovered constantly at the edge of every conversation. Like a door neither of us touched, even though we both knew it existed. Betty changed in small ways. She laughed just as often, but sometimes it came a second too late. She listened, but her thoughts drifted away more easily. When I spoke about the future, she stayed present, but her eyes no longer followed the words all the way to the end. I had lived long enough to recognize that pattern. It was not guilt, it was fear. One morning, I woke up alone in her bed, the other side cold. A note on the table. Went out early, back later. Sorry. No explanation. I walked through the city 4 hours that day. Let Chiang Mai absorb my restlessness. Monks passed silently. Tourists complained loudly. Life went on without noticing my internal imbalance. By the time I returned to her place, dusk had settled. She was there, sitting on the floor, shoes still on, bag untouched. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded too quickly. That night, for the first time, we did not touch, not out of distance, but out of restraint. The next days followed the same rhythm, together, but cautious, honest in tone, incomplete in content. I decided not to interrogate her, not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I wanted the truth to come freely, not extracted. The house search paused naturally. Neither of us mentioned it. The listings stayed open on my laptop, untouched. One evening, she asked me something unexpected. "Do you regret not having children?" The question landed without warning. I thought carefully before answering. "Yes," I said. And "No." She waited. "I regret not having the chance," I continued. "But I do not regret my life. Grief already took enough from me." She looked down at her hands. That was when I knew. The door existed, and was close. She did not speak that night, or the next day, or the one after, but the tension sharpened. Every smile felt rehearsed, every plan provisional. On the fourth day, she canceled dinner. "I need to tell you something," she said over the phone. "But not today." I did not sleep much that night. Not because I feared losing her, but because I sensed that whatever she was carrying had already cost her peace. And I knew one thing for certain. Some truths do not destroy relationships. They only destroy illusions. The day she finally spoke, I knew the rhythm of the apartment would change. We were sitting at her small kitchen table, the evening light soft and warm, coffee cooling in front of us. She took a deep breath, folded her hands, and looked straight at me. "There is something I have not told you," she said quietly. I nodded. Let her continue. My stomach twisted, but I stayed calm. "I have a child," she said, 7 years old. Lives with my sister in Chiang Mai. I have been raising him there while I have built my shop." The words landed like stones in water. The surface remained smooth, but ripples spread everywhere inside me. I stayed silent. This was not a secret about money, or work, or irresponsibility. It was a part of her life I had not known, intentionally withheld. A life that did not include me, yet had shaped everything about her. She explained carefully, not defensive, not apologetic, just factual. "I was afraid," she said, "afraid that you would think differently, afraid it would end things before we had a chance." I wanted to say something comforting, reassuring, but the first thought that came was simpler. I do not know if I can do this. The truth hit harder than I had expected. I had imagined her as independent, capable, responsible. She was all that, and more. She was also a mother, a role I had not considered in my quiet calculations of life after loss. I felt the weight of years, of grief, of expectation. The child was not a threat, but it was reality, and reality always asks something of you. She waited, patiently. I told her everything I felt, how I admired her, how I feared intrusion, how I had imagined a future with her, always without the complexities of parenthood. She did not interrupt, She only listened. I, I did not lie, she said finally. I only protected you, and myself, for a while, until I knew what this could mean. The honesty struck me. I realized then that my hesitation was not about fear of her child. It was fear of stepping into a life that was not entirely mine, fear of responsibility, fear of the unknown, fear of being vulnerable again. But I also realized something else. If I walked away now, it would not be because of her choices. It would be because of mine. I stayed silent for a long time. Coffee cooled. The city murmured outside. My heart raced with decisions I could not postpone. Finally, I spoke. I do not know everything yet, I said. I do not know how this works. But I do know I do not want to leave you. Her relief was quiet, almost imperceptible. She smiled slightly. Not all the way, not yet, but it was the first step. The secret had been spoken, and the future had begun, cautiously, honestly, and uncertainly. After she spoke, silence became heavy in a way it never had before. Not the comfortable silence of a vacation morning, but the deliberate, thoughtful silence of people weighing lives together. I walked through Chiang Mai alone the next day, my mind looping endlessly. A child, her child, part of her world that I had never imagined entering. It was not fear of the child, exactly. I had spent years without children. I knew what that absence felt like. It was fear of responsibility. Fear of becoming part of someone else's story when I had spent decades writing my own. Yet I could not ignore the pull either. I thought about my life back in Wales, a house, the business, the quiet routines. Safe, predictable, complete, and yet empty. I remembered her words from that first evening. Some lives are finished properly. Some just stop. Mine had stopped. Now it had a choice, to stay still or to continue. I called her that night. We spoke quietly, about the shop, about the child, about small things, breakfast routines, the best route to the market, mundane details that felt profoundly grounding. She never pushed. She simply offered reality. I realized then that a life with her and the child would not be about passion or rescue. It would be about participation, consistency, daily decisions that mattered more than any grand gesture. The next morning, I began to consider the house seriously, not for fantasy, not for escape, but for the three of us, a place where routines could settle, where the child could have stability, and where Petty could continue to run her business without interruption. We visited neighborhoods quietly. Not luxury, not flashy, just homes that felt lived in, that welcomed continuity. Each day, I felt my hesitation ebb slightly. Each conversation with her reinforced the trust I had begun to place in her. Her child, her life, was not a barrier. It was an invitation into honesty. I started to understand something essential. Love is not only about what you desire, it is also about what you accept, and acceptance does not remove challenge. It only changes how you face it. By the end of that week, I felt something I had not in years. Possibility. Not certainty, not comfort, but possibility, the quiet, deliberate kind that grows in small decisions, not grand promises. The next step would require courage. The choice to integrate her child into my world, to fully step into a life that was already hers. But for the first time, I did not feel the weight as a burden. I felt it as a measure of life, real, unvarnished, and waiting, and I wanted to step forward. The days that followed were quieter, in a different sense. Not calm, not effortless, but real, practical, shared. We began to plan small things first. A consistent schedule for her child, a routine for the shop, visits to the market together. The house search became deliberate, not rushed. We looked at neighborhoods where schools were near, where streets were quiet, where life could expand without imposing. I was learning patience I did not know I still possessed. Petty was learning trust she had long withheld. And slowly, the three of us became a rhythm. I met her child gradually. At first, brief exchanges, coffee shared in the kitchen while she supervised play, observing, listening, learning. There was laughter, but also hesitance. Boundaries had to be respected. I did not try to replace anyone. I did not try to overstep. I simply existed in the spaces she allowed, consistently, without drama. The house search ended on a quiet street, modest but solid, a home that would fit all three of us without forcing compromise. We signed the papers together, carefully, deliberately, a gesture more than a promise. Living together was a lesson in small, meaningful acts. Morning routines, dinner preparations, homework help, balancing the sharpest hours with family time. Each moment required attention, patience, and sometimes apology. But the work felt lighter than I expected because it was shared. Petty remained independent. Her shop continued. Her child continued. And I continued as myself, learning how to participate, not dominate. We did not need grand declarations of love. Our life was composed of repeated, quiet choices, to be present, to support, to respect. One evening, sitting on the balcony with the child asleep inside, Petty leaned on my shoulder. "I am glad you stayed," she said softly. I did not respond immediately. I simply held the moment, because staying was not a victory. It was not a triumph. It was a choice. One made every day, carefully, quietly, without expectation. The city hummed below us. Streetlights flickered. The sounds of life, motorcycles, distant voices, the occasional dog barking, reminded me that the world continued beyond our small bubble. But within it, we were grounded, not perfect, not without challenge, but present. The secret that had threatened to shift everything had instead become a foundation, a measure of honesty, trust, and willingness. And for the first time since my wife died, I felt something I had thought lost. A life that could grow, a family that could exist, a future that was deliberately chosen, not merely inherited from circumstance. Chiang Mai, with all its quiet temples and bustling markets, had given me more than peace. It had given me presence, connection, and finally, a home.
John arrived in Thailand expecting a quiet retirement. He did not expect a child to enter the picture. He did not expect life to ask more of him than he had planned. He certainly did not expect the weight of honesty to feel so heavy or so liberating. Hetty carried her past carefully. Her child was part of her life long before John entered it. The secret was not meant to deceive. It was meant to protect both him and herself. When the truth emerged, John faced the choice we'll all face in some form: to retreat into comfort or to embrace life fully, even when it is complicated. He chose to stay, not to rescue, not to replace what was lost, but to participate. Together, they built a life measured in ordinary moments: shared meals, routines, decisions, laughter, and responsibility. The child became part of their world naturally, without force or pretension. Chiang Mai offered more than scenery or calm. It offered presence, connection, a chance to live deliberately. And for John, that was enough. For those who wish to share their thoughts, reflections, or simply say hello, farangfootprints@gmail.com. Farang Footprints reminds us once again, love is not only about timing or circumstance. It is about honesty, trust, and the quiet choice to participate in someone else's life, even when it is not simple.